Welcome to a video on debates about deponents. One of the things that we have in our original Greek grammar is deponent verbs. And in Greek 1 and 2 coursework, people often get confused about deponents. When are the deponents? When are they not deponents? And we have a basic set of rules which I'll go over in the beginning and then I'll return to in the end after we've examined some of these debates. So let me start with our basic rules, and we'll go ahead and quickly click through some of the rest of the debates. Our basic rules in Greek 1 and 2 have been that we would look in the present tense for the omai. In the imperfect tense, look for the omai in the present tense. In the future tense, look for omai, and usually it occurs in oddities. In the aorist, I have a few oddities because the verb form is in the aorist, and in the perfect, we don't list any so far. But there are a couple that we will give you in this advanced discussion, which happened right at the end of the Greek 2 course. So let's go back and talk through the debates about deponents. First of all, let's talk about the voice and what is the voice according to Dr. Story's and Dr. Collins' Story's book on verb. By the way, the Greek to Me textbook was written by father and son team. Dr. Koine Story is the father. He was a professor of Greek at Harvard University, and Dr. Lyle Story, who's a professor of Greek at Regent University. Now, in the Greek to Me textbook, voice is what we are talking about when we have active, middle, passive, or even deponents. The voice is related to the subject of the verb and how the subject relates to the verb. For example, in the active voice, the subject does the action. In the middle voice, the subject does the action for myself. In the passive, the subject receives the action or is acted upon. Deponent verbs take the place of middle and passive verbs, and they appeared in the vocabulary in the Greek to Me with a middle passive ending, oh my, but they have active meanings. So I'd like to take you to another step deeper in this debate with Wallace, who describes beyond the basics. He defines a devotive middle voice as a middle voice verb that has no active form but an active meaning. The problem is that earlier grammar, such as the grammar from Robinson, speaks as dynamic middle, or other grammars talk about it as a synonym for the indirect middle, which is one of the other cases of further refinement of our basic middle voice. So when we get to something which we call deponent middle, and you'll find that in some of your online lexicons, it's when the deponent, the middle voice has been laid aside to take an active form. This word deponent really comes from the Latin deponere, which has to do with something laid aside, which means the middle original force of the verb is laid aside, whether it be a middle or a passive, for the active verb formation. So, as we said, we translated the oh my in active form. Now, there are two clarifications in this middle or any of the deponent case. There must be no active form, and there must be an active force at the root of the definition. Let's pick up the same definition of deponent from the passive and then go to these examples of these deponent verbs. In a passive deponent, the definitions of verb that has no active form, but may be active though in the passive form. Two common deponent passives are exegesis and apokryphethane. Okay, notice they have the active form in their definition. So there are three basic principles. There are two that there's observation and one that will help you determine it. For example, a deponent middle verb is one that has no active form. That means it has omai in a base form for a principal part in the Hellenistic. So notice, when it says a principal part, it's the 6 principal parts we learned in basic Greek. That's the present, the future, the aorist, the perfect active, the perfect passive, and the aorist passive. It may not have if it has a no active form, but is active in the present and the future, it is partially deponent. One example of that word is erkamai, where this occurs. Another is lambano, which has an active form in the present tense, but in the future tense, in the present tense, it has an active form, but it has an omai form in the future tense, which means it has no basic active form in the future tense. It's again partially deponent. And dunamai, which has no active form in any of the principal parts. It is always deponent. It is completely deponent. Many deponent verbs never had an active form in koinonia. Thus, we must go back to Hellenistic Greek to see if there might be an active form from Hellenistic Greek, which is the Greek which precedes koinonia, or Common Greek, or the more formal Greek at the koinonia time. Now, some deponent verbs never had an active force, but the definition has a middle force. For example, dekomai means I receive or welcome, and some people consider it as reflective, some people it's deponent. For example, Robertson, one of the earliest lexicons in 1929, says this is deponent, but it qualifies with a note that says it's reflexive. Therefore, the confusion occurs. Now, what can you do to do pragmatic decision? And this is on what is deponent, not should you be working on a translation we're not jointly working on. First of all, is there a lexical form in the BDAG? Is the lexical form middle or passive and not active? This is really the omai rule. If you see the omai there, it's probably deponent. There is a problem. The BDAG in this rough and ready rule only lists the lexical form of a word that is in the biblical or in the writings of the early church. Now, you may have the active form and not the omai, or not the omai if it's just not in the Bible or in these early church fathers. So the ideal approach is to go back and investigate the form in Moulton Millikan lexicon, which is a lexicon focusing on the general population of Greek or common man's Greek at the time of the 1st century, when the biblical scriptures, or maybe during the 1st to 3rd century when early church fathers were writing. In there, they've gone and looked across archaeology texts that they had from that time. Little Scott Jones has gone back further into the classical Greek, and that will look at the writings from Homer and various things. You should investigate the form. You should be able to see the omai form, or that is not an active form in the base form, and a middle force in the word. So, Wallace says the following are true deponent words, and we've seen many of these in our case. And notice he has in lansamai only deponent in the future. We have other things that we call deponent in the future. Proserchomai is easy because BDAG says it's active. Okay, but verbs that loop deponent, but he might cause, Wallace would say, not. Little Scots Classical Greek in us, a arnic omai says it's really deponent. And Moulton Milligan said it's a modern Greek word, so we don't really see a key. Maybe I'm missing something in Moulton Milligan, but we can go further into that if that's a word you're studying. We have aspazomai, which means to greet, to welcome, and it's often written in a letter. Now, Moulton Milligan showed conclusive this was a technical term for the greeting at the end of the letter. Little Scott suggests that it's deponent in the classical Greek. It seems to have an active form. Is it active deponent? Wallace just suggests it not. You would have to footnote that it probably is deponent in your definition. So those are the two that are really there. In most of these, for example, it's not there in Moulton Milligan. The only one that you find in both is logizomai, which is thoughts, and that was noted in Wallace that it might be there. So again, we have decomai, which is mentioned in Moulton Milligan's Koine Greek, but not in Little Scott, and so there's always a question. Now, let's go back to the rules. In the verbs we have, which are the common verbs in the New Testament, we say look for the omai. There you will have an example because it comes from the New Testament for the omai. If you look for the imperfect tense, that will follow the omai, and the future will follow the omai because the future principal part will not have the active. The aorist has a few omais, but we use that to do that, and we have no existence except dunamai and something that are completely active that would happen in the perfect. So this is why this oddities in aorist, we've given you the principal parts and noted which ones are across. We've also noted the verbs which are referenced out of these base verbs because a verb plus a preposition does not change the omai features because it still retains the active form and the active function. We note that archomai has a principal part only in the present tense. We've listed decomai because it's on the edge in the three principal parts, including an aorist part because it's listed by Robinson. Euangelizomai was listed across it. Charizomai was listed. We've noticed the oddity of charizomai, which is I rejoice, and blepomai, which also seems to have a middle only New Testament that is deponent. Again, some of these have this active form. Again, phobeomai is listed here and in the aorist form. For these ones that are with in the aorist passive, make sure when you're writing a research paper to footnote that it has been denoted as aorist, but take a look at it in those two places. And here is scalinzomai, which is in the future tense. Well, the books that I mentioned were Wallace, Daniel Wallace, Beyond the Basics, Exegetical Syntax, the New Testament, and Robertson, A Grammar of New Testament in Light of Historical Research. Please let me know if this has been helpful to you or if you have additional questions. Thank you.